So what is the Bond Act? As I noted, it's $4.2 billion of bondable funds that will flow to communities all across New York State. It's broken down into these four categories that you can see on the screen here: climate change mitigation, restoration and flood risk reduction, open space land conservation and recreation, and water quality improvement and resilient infrastructure. So those are the four general categories that are provided for in the law. And so there are different funding amounts out of that $4.2 billion for each of those different categories. And then within those categories, the legislation also has subcategories. And we'll talk through each of those so that you can understand where this money is being directed through the Bond Act. So the priorities of the Bond Act are many-fold. It's a big pot of money, for sure, but there's also a lot to be done. And so when we're developing the programs to implement the Bond Act, we're guided by a couple of different priorities. So updating infrastructure. There's a lot of old infrastructure, as we know, all throughout New York State that needs to be updated. And that was a key component of the passage of the Bond Act. All sorts of infrastructure that protects people and also protects the environment are really getting towards the end of their useful life. And so there are funds that will be dedicated to updating and enhancing that infrastructure. Of course, protecting natural resources. For us at DEC, that's top of the list. We've all dedicated our lives to environmental conservation at DEC, and so we're very focused on protecting natural resources. But in doing that, we're also going to be creating jobs. The Bond Act itself is going to be creating many jobs that my colleague will outline for you all across the state. So there's a big economic impact of the money flowing from the Bond Act out into communities all across New York State and New York City. And then there are also environmental justice components that have been built into the Bond Act that are legislated. 35% of the benefits of that $4.2 billion must go to what's called disadvantaged communities. We'll explain disadvantaged communities tonight and talk about those goals. 35% of those funds are required, but our goal is really to bring it up to 40%. And so we're designing our programs and doing the type of community engagement that's necessary to hit those goals. So to start talking about green jobs, I'll introduce my colleague again, Adriana Espinosa.
Folks at home to see you too. All right, good evening everyone. Good to see you. Good to be back in the Iowa Center. I love being here. I was here a few months ago as well for a climate justice walking tour that Assemblymember Anderson put together for us, and so it's great to be back here in Shoulder. I brought my notes because I didn't want to get these figures wrong. So Patrick mentioned earlier, the Bond Act overall is $4.2 billion, right? There was an independent study done that estimated that the initiative will support $8.71 billion in project spending and support the creation of 84,000 jobs. There are strong labor standards that were built into the language of the Bond Act, and part of improving infrastructure and environmental quality and outcomes for residents, there's also an economic component of that, right? And part of improving well-being is the economic advancement that comes from these infrastructure upgrades and other upgrades that are made throughout the communities. And so the Bond Act will, we believe, the project spending will create an estimated, or support an estimated 84,000 jobs. A lot of those with things like construction jobs, right? From building out these projects. There are also protections in the Bond Act to support good paying jobs. So there are requirements for prevailing wages. Any recipient of a Bond Act dollar must be paid prevailing wages to the workers working on that project. That was a sort of important part of the Bond Act. There are also provisions in there for apprenticeship agreements for large state or municipal projects and encouraging labor peace agreements. And then there's also Buy America provisions for things like structural steel. So that is something that we're really proud of in New York State, to be able to not only advance the Bond Act, but make sure that we are encouraging economic development and economic security at the same time. We also, as Patrick mentioned, have a priority for environmental justice. And part of that is recognition that while we have this amazing opportunity in front of us for spending this $4.2 billion, we're not doing so in a vacuum, right? That there are existing burdens that have been faced by communities for generations, and that we have an entire generation worth of scientific research that underscores the fact that low-income communities and communities of color in particular face a disproportionate burden of environmental hazards that includes climate change risk. And we also know that climate change is a threat multiplier, right? So climate change will affect all of us, but everyone will not be affected equally. And that the existing burdens that you have, your wages, your health outcomes, and how many children you have, or if you have elderly adults that you care for in your life, all of those things affect how you are impacted and how you respond to the impacts of climate change. And so it's important to bake that knowledge and understanding and prioritization into how we spend the Bond Act dollars. And the way that we do that through the Bond Act is in a number of ways, but one I'll highlight here is that there's a requirement that 35% with a goal of 40% of Bond Act spending needs to benefit what's termed disadvantaged communities. And I did want to underscore that, although we do have this requirement there, that all communities will remain eligible for the Bond Act. So this is a high-level view of what disadvantaged communities looks like statewide. This process was almost a 3-year-long process that was undertaken by the Climate Justice Working Group, which includes appointed environmental justice advocates from across the state. There's also state representatives on that working group that includes DEC, who chairs and leads the work, the Department of Labor, the Department of Health, and NYSERDA, which is the Energy Research and Development Authority for New York State. Sure.
I don't know how to interpret this map. How can I interpret what's disadvantaged and not?
So we're gonna just take all the questions after the presentation.
Okay.
I have another map for you, but
Okay.
to sort of zoom in. I wanted to give you the full picture of this is what it looks like for New York State. If you can see here, this is zoomed in more on New York City. If you go to climate.ny.gov, there is an interactive map, and you can zoom in and see exactly what, put in your address and see exactly what the map looks like in your neighborhood. Where the working group landed to finalize this map was they looked at over 170 different indicators and narrowed it down to just 45 different indicators that make up this map. And those indicators fall into 4 main buckets. So this map is a combination of vulnerability to climate change, exposure to environmental hazards, so the existing pollution burden, your socioeconomic outcomes, so the race, income, rent burden, energy usage, energy bill rates, those are all factored in under there. And then finally, public health outcomes, so asthma hospitalizations and other items, as a combination of all 45 of those within those 4 buckets that make up this map here. So the Bond Act will make sure that at least 35% with a goal of 40 benefits these communities. I'll also mention that the work isn't done. We just voted in March to finalize this map for the first time, but this is an iterative process in recognition that populations change, populations move, we get better data as time goes on, and so this map has to be revisited annually to be voted on again. And with that, I'll turn it back to Patrick to talk a little bit more about the climate change bucket for the Bond Act.
Thanks, Adriana. So as I noted, there are discrete funding categories, 4 of them, under the Bond Act. So we're going to go through each one of those categories in turn and start off with climate change mitigation. I do want to note for everybody that when we keep talking about Bond Act projects, and it's important for everybody, I think, conceptually to understand that projects need to be bondable in order to be funded through the Bond Act. And in order for them to be bondable, just as a guideline, they must have a useful life of at least 10 years. So we're going to show you different types and examples of projects that would fit the bill, things that were not funded by the Bond Act because it's new, but the types of projects that you can fund with Bond Act dollars. And that's a requirement of this type of state funding and the mechanism to get $4.2 billion into communities. So it's not things like costs for food and lodging. That's not bondable. Operation and maintenance of facilities. That would not be bondable. Equipment, furniture, and all those types of expenses. That's not stuff that you can fund through the Bond Act. But the actual places and the infrastructure, those things can be funded through the Bond Act. So let's go through a couple examples to hit that home. Climate change mitigation, we'll start there with that bucket of funds. So it's $1.5 billion, it's a lot of money. Within that $1.5 billion, you have $500 million that's set aside for zero emission school buses and charging. So already $500 million of that $1.5 billion is set aside specifically for zero emission school buses and charging. And I think Susanna will maybe talk about that, or could talk about that a little bit more, and where we're at in the process of getting that money out the door and in the communities, so we can get those e-buses on the road and also help protect kids and their air quality. $400 million is for green building projects. A lot of that $400 million is going to be probably funneled into infrastructure and state facilities and places like that. But it is also, there are multiple different types of green building projects that may be funded with portions of that $400 million. Not less than $200 million is dedicated to reducing pollution in disadvantaged communities. So this is money that's specific for disadvantaged communities. $200 million is dedicated in this particular bucket to go to disadvantaged communities. So we have our goals of 35 to 40% overall for all of the Bond Act, but we are required to make sure that not less than $200 million go to disadvantaged communities, specifically for climate change mitigation and adaptation projects. That's why it's in this bucket. $100 million would go to sort of general climate adaptation and mitigation projects. And then we have this $300 million, not free-for-all, for sure. There are specific examples of where that money can go in the Bond Act, but it's not so specific. So it could go to things like urban forestry projects, urban heat mitigation projects, carbon sequestration, lots of those sort of big ticket things, but also projects that could also impact locally, directly, communities. So there's lots of opportunities within this bucket, I would say, for communities like this one to take advantage of Bond Act funds. And about that $200 million for funding to reduce pollution in disadvantaged communities, we're trying hard to make sure that smaller grassroots organizations are also going to be able to access that funding. So there will be opportunities in our design of our programs to ensure that really local groups can have access to that funding. And they won't go to just larger nonprofits or other entities. Most of this funding will be going to nonprofits or to governments, so local municipalities, which in New York City would mean City of New York. So these are some examples under the climate change mitigation and adaptation. So there are already zero-emission buses that are rolling around in the state of New York. These might be upstate in Rochester, maybe, or someplace.
I think there's already one of that too.
There we go. Also in Long Island. There we go. And we're going to get them in New York City as well. So that's a type of project, right, that's specifically called out for in the Act. Then we have the sorts of projects that you can see there on the right-hand side, the Javits Center Green Roof. So I don't know if anybody here has been to the Javits Center Green Roof. It's in Manhattan. It's a super impressive green roof. It's, I think, an acre in size. And there's a working farm up there on top of that roof. So that's also a type of project that you could fund potentially through the Bond Act and reliant on this climate change mitigation and adaptation category. So let's talk about also another category, restoration and flood risk reduction. That's $1.1 billion. And that's broken down into these smaller categories. So $250 million of that $1.1 billion is for voluntary private property buyouts. So we've seen this in the past, definitely in New York City. New York City is no stranger to extreme weather events, as we all know. And some of those coastal properties who have been hardest hit have been offered voluntary buyouts in the past. Different places in Staten Island, for example, in other places in New York, also in the Rockaways. So this is gearing up to be another round of voluntary private property buyouts, and we're working on designing those programs. $100 million of that $1.1 billion, so I guess that 0.1 part of the billion, goes to coastal rehabilitation and shoreline restoration projects, so specifically to those projects on our shoreline. Another $100 million for local waterfront revitalization and inland flooding. And then this sort of large, undefined to some extent category is bigger than the last one. It's $650 million. So $650 million out of that $1.1 billion is for other projects, and these are examples, excuse me, of those other projects. So I think near and dear to some people's hearts in this area would be raising and relocating flood-prone roads and infrastructure. There are some nearby that I think people would like to see maybe raised and redesigned. Adaptation to dams, bridges, and culverts. We don't have a lot of dams in New York City that would apply to, but bridges and culverts, definitely. Floodplain, wetland, and stream restoration. There are some examples of that, definitely up in the Bronx. Forest conservation could be included in this category. And things like land acquisition. I will say that land acquisition in New York City, when you're using public funds, is always a difficult thing to do because of the cost of land here as opposed to land in other parts of the state. But we work very diligently to identify opportunities for land acquisition, and we're going to be working hard to do that here in New York City throughout the lifespan of the Bond Act as well. So let's look at some projects. So if we're talking about restoration and flood risk, these are a couple of projects just in New York City. So this dam at the Bronx Zoo was improved, and it improved both water maintenance and also habitat and ecological improvements and enhancements for the area. So that's sort of a win-win project. That's something that oftentimes, if there's a call that will come out for projects under the Bond Act, having a project that is like checking off multiple boxes in terms of what it's really benefiting out in the world are always things that I think that we look for. Also, Canarsie Fresh Creek Coastal Protection. You can see this is again the type of infrastructure that is bondable under the Bond Act. So those are two examples in New York City, and with that, I'd like to move on to the other categories. And Susanna is going to take us through those categories and then finish us out in the presentation. Susanna?
Thanks. Need these to see the keys. There we go. So the next
As Patrick has noted, walk through each of these categories have the specific things you can find. The first program, or dollars out the door as it were announced earlier this year, and applications were accepted through August. And that was for $200 million of investment in water infrastructure improvement projects. And those are largely wastewater treatment facility type projects. They're Clean Water Act projects, so intermunicipal grants. It's a program through the Environmental Facilities Corporation. And what happened, and this is a process that I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, is they published eligibility criteria, guidelines. They took comments on that, and then they developed, based on those comments and the parameters, a program. They combined that $200 million with $225 million from Bill, which I'll talk more about in a moment, some of these federal funding pots that are floating around for the next couple of years. And I'll touch base more on Bill, or the bipartisan infrastructure law, as it's often known as, more commonly referred to as Bill. The other two kind of categories under the water quality improvement and resilient infrastructure bucket of money, so to speak, are $250 million to support municipal stormwater grants. And there's a specific focus within the language of the Act on nature-based or green infrastructure solutions to this. And so that's something that I think certainly would be of interest in terms of localized flooding issues that folks are seeing across, not just this area, but all across the state. There's also $200 million, like the other categories, that's a little bit more broadly defined, right? So there's a little bit of a laundry list of potential things that could be included for funding. And that's including green infrastructure again, agricultural nutrient runoff, so addressing water quality from those pollutant sources, replacing substandard septic tanks. There's a program that has been run for many years, so it's looking to infuse maybe some cash into that. Reducing or preventing harmful algal blooms. When we think about hot summer days, one of the most important things is getting access to cooling off in the water, and the harmful algal blooms are a real health concern for recreation, for larger health, for water quality, in terms of drinking water supplies and so forth. And finally, lead service line replacement. This is something that we have a legacy all across, not just the state, but across the country. Lead service lines, so lead pipes leading into our homes that supply us with our drinking water. Some examples, and these are more of the kind of wastewater infrastructure, kind of the things when we talk about Buy America provisions in terms of steel and rebar and iron that's going to stay in place. We're going to find that more in projects like this. The first one on the top is the Tibbetts Brook Project Daylighting. This is a rendering of that project, really getting the stormwater and the sewer and the creeks separated again. Back in the day when we built combined sewers, that was the best technology of the day. It was all about getting sewage away from us as quick as possible. Times change, and we've learned that that's not necessarily the best approach, right? So we've got a lot of work to do in separating out those types of water. The second project on the bottom, an example, is a shot of progress that's happening at the North River Treatment Plant. It's a dechlorination facility, so it's about once they clean up the water, making sure that there's not so much chlorine residual in that water when it goes back into the river. And that's really important in terms of protecting habitat, preventing other chemicals from forming. When you have a chlorine residual and sediment in the water, you can have some chemical reactions that happen from other contaminants. So pulling that out of there, making sure we have clean water downstream of the treatment plant. And the fourth and final category of the buckets of money is open space, land conservation, and recreation. And there's $650 million in this category. The top is $300 million towards open space land conservation, $150 million towards farmland protection and easements, $75 million towards fish hatcheries. And fish hatcheries is I'm going to mention it because one of the overwhelming themes across the Bond Act is that we promulgate or we put out for public comment eligibility criteria guidelines. To propose what should be eligible, what are the rules of the road for the different types of funding that's announced. Fish hatcheries are one of the few that that's not the case. There's only 7 fish hatcheries in the state. There's actually an 8th that Parks owns, but is not moving forward with. So, there's not an eligibility criteria really for the existing fish hatcheries. It's how do we modernize them, make them more interactive with the public, and improve upon them so that we can be more successful in supporting habitat projects and supporting fisheries across the state of New York. And the final bucket, again, one of those big broad categories, $125 million to support recreational infrastructure. This is state and municipal parks, this is campgrounds, this is facilities all across the state. Places like this, right? Amazing environmental ed centers, and as Patrick noted, it's about the capital cost or bondable cost. So to build facilities like this would be an example of a great project that might be a bond act funded project through one of the many grant programs that will be offered. A couple other examples, Snug Harbor Cultural Center and Botanical Gardens. And what I think is really cool about not just the Snug Harbor site, but also here is accessibility, right? Folks can get out on the trails, the grade is right, the paths are paved or hard packed, or the different types of materials are used, so we have more accessible facilities for folks to get out there. And in Snug Harbor, I think there's access to gardens and the water, and here the salt marsh is awesome. I was like, I wish I got here earlier. You got to sneak out, you got to like it, I know, you got out there. I was like, jealous. And then finally, Roberto Clemente State Park, I think are folks familiar, huge project of the Bronx, that a tremendous opportunity for improvements, not just in recreational playground, but also in terms of the watershed and the waterfront and so many elements in terms of, as Patrick noted, there are going to be multiple benefits from each of these projects. It's not just one type of project. You do a green roof like the one we saw a moment ago at the Javits Center. You have pollinators up there. It helps with the building envelope in terms of urban heat island. It's also an energy efficiency practice, and it's a stormwater management practice, and it's an air quality practice. So the list really starts to, when you start to look at some of these green practices, you start to get so many multiple benefits. When you look at mental health, looking out over a green space, for example, on top of the Javits roof versus a blacktop roof, there are health benefits that have been documented in studies looking at natural systems versus built systems. So all of these things, how can we snowball the positive benefits, is really one of the themes, I think, of the types of projects that we're looking to see come out of the Bond Act, having multiplied benefits for folks across the state. And so the multiplier effect is a big theme here, right? It's a theme in the jobs, right? So in terms of taking those dollars and hiring both direct and indirect folks of jobs and induced jobs that come out of things. But it's also about how we pull in more federal dollars. On the state level this year, unprecedented numbers, really kudos, hats off to the governor and the legislators for $400 million that were in the enacted 2023-2024 budget for the Environmental Protection Fund. This is really important stuff. This is programs that support planning and education programs and environmental justice programs, so many grant programs that have been making an impact across the state, but that also help prepare projects as a project pipeline to be ready to apply for capital dollars, those bondable dollars through the Bond Act, right? So because the Bond Act can't support things like a planning project, there are other programs, thankfully, that can support that through the Environmental Protection Fund funds. The other funding source I want to give kind of a shout out to, because it's so critical, is $500 million also this year towards clean water infrastructure. So it's about drinking water, it's about wastewater, and these critical needs. And when we flush the toilet, we don't mostly think, oh, where's that going? But somebody's got to, and that's really important stuff. That's what keeps things moving and keeps our community safe. It's a huge public health thing, and it's a huge economic development. And if we don't have clean water, we're in trouble. And that's incredible because that is $500 million of $5 billion that the state has invested in clean water infrastructure since 2017. That's really important. The state is really making an investment in communities around the state to make things right and to modernize things where we need to. The federal funding pots, or buckets as it were, I mentioned Bill, but Bill's also known by another name. I like to call it EJA because it's a little easier to say than Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, but they're the same thing. So Bill and EJA, it's really just two names for the same act. And then there's the Inflation Reduction Act, which is more of the energy efficiency and vouchers and solar programs that we're seeing come out of the federal government. And then there's the CHIPS and Science Act, which folks refer to as CHIPS. And one of the focuses that we've had is looking at what are funding opportunities with those federal dollars that might be a good match for Bond Act dollars too. And there's more to come on that. We're not gonna, it's one of the things that we've heard, so we're taking that in as feedback on how do we craft programs that help facilitate that, help facilitate matching dollars from the feds. Basically, our money that we've sent to Washington to bring it back home to do work for us, right? So what we did is this process, the Bond Act was passed in November, as Patrick noted, and really it's a hats off and kudos to everyone who went out and voted for it, right? It was an overwhelming support, which doesn't happen a lot these days, overwhelming bipartisan support for the Bond Act, which is awesome. And it really showed the priority that we as a state have for clean water, clean air, and green jobs. So we traveled around the state, holding sessions to present kind of the basics of the Bond Act, and we're doing that tonight, but then to also get feedback from folks. We had a project survey. We're still trying to cull through that list and clean it up. We will be publishing it all the comments that we got on that online. And trying to edit the webpage so we kind of update to where we are in terms of next steps right now. And so we went around the state, and from these listening sessions, we will take the feedback to then incorporate into programs. So one of the common questions I get asked is, how do I apply for the Bond Act program? Well, there isn't a Bond Act program per se. There are many other partner agencies and authorities, NIPA is one potentially, and Department of State and Parks, and the list goes on, through which programs will be offered. So Patrick mentioned the public school bus program. So the process that we followed is that that one's a little bit more kind of direct. The act is very specific that we are going to invest $500 million in public school buses that are zero emission buses. So electric buses is the technology at hand right now, and the charging infrastructure. Eligibility criteria guidelines were developed. We published those out and got comments back. And then was it a week or 2 weeks ago? The days kind of start to run together, so my apologies. We announced that we're going to start accepting applications for that program. The first step is for the providers of school buses, the vendors, as it were, to register. So it gives them a head start to say, okay, I got to get my paperwork in to make sure that the different providers of busing. So it could be school districts, it could be contractors. There are many ways that school districts across the state provide busing. And it differs. New York City schools do it differently than, say, Albany schools. And so, in a couple of weeks, the system will be up and ready for applications to come in from those districts or vendors or contractors, I think is a better word, who provide the busing itself, right? So that they can go and it's a voucher program. So they say, okay, we need to buy a new bus, but instead of buying a new diesel bus, we're going to buy an electric bus. And what is the difference in cost between those two? The electric buses are more money, and so the program is paying the difference. That's what the voucher program works. The NYSERDA website already has all the info up there, and it's live and up in terms of getting the word out there. And it's really important in terms of, at least for that program, the calendar year that they need to follow in terms of school districts that go into their board and go to their budgets, make sure that they incorporate that and then can plan accordingly. And so the program has been rolled out to be respectful of what that timeline looks like and what those needs are for school districts and for the contractors providing busing for schools. So this is kind of the process we're going to go through with every program that rolls out with Bond Act dollars being used. The agency or authority that's offering the program will look at the comments that we've received to date, craft those eligibility criteria. It might mean that they need to tweak an existing program, like to change the rules a little bit, right? It might mean that they say, oh gosh, this is a match. This program really fits the needs that we're hearing. How much money can we successfully administer through program in this round of funding? Let's get some eligibility criteria out there, get some feedback on it, and then launch a program. And that's what we'll be doing for each of the programs that use Bond Act dollars. And so I think Did you mention interagency groups? I don't know if you did. So there are interagency workers that were established for each of these 4 categories to take in feedback and to look at existing programs and say, how do we best deliver on this? So they're working through comments now that we've received that we're working on cleaning up. Some folks felt they might need to put their personal phone number in the description, and we're like, no, we don't want to broadcast that to everyone. So that's part of what we're doing is going through, but all the comments will be put up on the web shortly. And then deliver those guidelines. And so one of the things I want to encourage you to do right now is write down the website and the email list. So I'll hover on that for a moment. With the web edits, there should be soon a little button that makes it easy that says, yes, add me to your email list, keep me up to date. But that's what I want to encourage you to do, because we're working to then, each time something gets announced for comment, or we're looking for feedback again, for example, or we have a new program launch, we will be sending that out to folks on the list. And so I want to make sure you stay in touch and stay aware of what's happening, and can give us feedback. Should I cover?
I think we can leave it.
And I think I think the last one is just a thank you, so we can end on the thank you. The thank you is the information. There you go. So if you guys have questions, please. And another shameless plug. There's a couple things on the table that we brought. One is this is a list of all sorts of funding. It's not just state. It's also those federal funds that I mentioned. It's like there's a lot of different programs. It's a little bit dazzling and bedazzling. And then this is a little bit of it's got the QR code thingy about the Spanish community, and a little blurb on that to help you kind of navigate that a little bit.
So really quickly, everyone, thank you so much, DC, for that presentation. I'm going to have the assembly member come in, so we just have to figure out this volume. Do you know which remote is?
You go to the side, I guess.
The side. Yeah, we won't mute the room so he can speak. And then on Zoom itself, you can mute the room.
Can you hear me? All right. I don't know if you guys can hear me. Okay. Oh, great. Okay. Awesome. All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much to my staff. I have my Deputy Chief of Staff and Legislative Director, Monet Schultz, at the Eastern Queens Alliance this evening. I want to thank my partner, State Senator James Sanders Jr., as well as the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. I see Patrick Foster, our regional representative, as well as I think the Deputy Commissioner is there, right, Patrick? Deputy Commissioner is in there. Awesome. So I want to thank you all for putting on this presentation. And most importantly, I want to thank all of the voters who are on the Zoom and are in person at the Eastern Queens Alliance. Thank the Eastern Queens Alliance, of course, Barbara Brown, Gloria Boyce Charles, and all of our community partners. And I thank you all specifically because you all voted to make this happen. You all turned over the back of your ballot and voted to allow the state to bond against $4.2 billion in projects to really help move our environmental goals forward. And that's what we are looking to do with this capital funding. And so I urged the DEC when I saw their listening session calendar and that there were no locations in Southeast Queens or Queens, I urged them to please get a listening session out here because our residents really, really need to make sure that their voices are heard in this process. And so I thank the Deputy Commissioner and Patrick for joining us for a tour. Was it earlier this year or last year? Where we toured neighborhoods, areas, census tracts specifically that were not in the first draft of the disadvantaged communities map. Again, it doesn't mean that those communities will not be able to receive that thing if they have shovel-ready projects that have, that meet the requirements and are 10 years or more, as Patrick explained. But it does mean that we have to work harder to make sure that we have stronger and more precise regional projects that'll help with flooding and help with other things that we're living through across the district. I do know there were many census tracts left out of the disadvantaged communities in Southeast Queens, and I lobbied along with my other colleagues to show those. Ultimately, the final map did them exclude from regional projects that impact everything from groundwater to sewer upgrades, to baffle walls, to all of the things that you all mentioned in the presentation, whether it's flood mitigation or green building projects. These are things that are going to be critical to growing and expanding our infrastructure in communities like ours that are negatively impacted by environmental justice. So I thank all of the participants for being on the call tonight. And I thank, again, Eastern Queens Alliance for opening up their home, the Environmental Center at Springfield Gardens. If you have not visited, it is a beautiful, beautiful center where it intersects community and the environment. And I really appreciate the hard work that Barbara Brown does, Gloria Boyce Charles, and the rest of their board and leadership that is active. And of course, a special shout out to all of our civic associations who are on the Zoom call and are in person tonight. Your advocacy is ultimately going to ensure that that money is steered properly to our communities. When I was in Springfield Gardens less than a month ago, when I was in Springfield Gardens less than a month ago, due to the storm that we recently received, the heavy rainwaters, we saw Springfield Gardens and South Ozone Park, Springfield Gardens, Rosedale, and the Rockaways that never flooded before. And we saw that, and it even more so proved that I'm ever-present threat that can and will impact artists if we don't take it seriously. So again, I thank you. I thank you, DEC. I thank you, EQA. I thank Team Sanders. I thank my team sitting in the conversations tonight. It's really about you all feedback on what folks environmentally related capital projects with a lifespan of 10 years or more is really, really what we want to hear. And I want DEC to hear tonight as they're going through this process. So I will step back and allow the leaders to step up and continue to uplift tonight's listening session. Thank you guys so much, and looking forward to seeing you guys out in the district. Schultz, I think your sound went. Your sound went. I don't know how y'all can get the sound back up.
Yes.
Okay, so
All back. You're all back.
what? Are there any projects in the works specifically in Southeast Queens that you guys could tell me about that might be happening that would benefit Southeast Queens and not Jacob Javits, or not that I'm not concerned with Jacob Javits or anyplace else, but are there any plans for any type of project in the Southeast Queens area?
So I think that there are ongoing projects that are primarily that the city is undertaking. So New York City is undertaking in Southeast Queens. There are large, I think probably many of you have experienced the disruptions in your streets and things like that that are going on with the city's projects in this area. And
So
those type, yeah.
So that's from the Bond Act funds?
No.
Or is there anything different?
no. So I bring up those types of projects that are going on in this neighborhood because you're asking, is there anything happening? So those types of projects, right, would be the types of projects that would then be supported potentially through this pot of money. So there are municipalities, there are organizations that are doing projects all over the city, and we have, our agency does provide funding for projects all throughout the city. We have environmental justice grants that different organizations apply for, and they get funding, and they do projects in their communities. There's also funding that flows through us that goes to municipalities. Here in New York City, it would be the city, right? And so this is another large pot of money that is going to be supporting more of that work. So this presentation is about like the future and what types of projects can happen in those communities. There are definitely things that are going on here in Southeast Queens that I would say probably need more support financially because there are some large problems here. There are also opportunities for smaller community-based projects, I think, all throughout neighborhoods, all throughout the city, and especially in a place like Southeast Queens where there is such a dedication and such an infrastructure of activated folks who really care about this place, care about their community, and care about environmental protection and conservation as well. So yes, I think there are projects that are ongoing, and there's definitely state funding that goes into those projects. We talked a little bit about, for example, the water quality funding that's already sort of out into the world. And this is more money that can go to those types of projects. You guys want to add anything? No?
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Evie Boyd. I sit on this board of the Rosedale Civic Association. I serve as the Civic's president and board chairperson. One of the projects that is supposed to be in phase 2 is the elevation of raising Snake Road. That's Brookville Boulevard south. That stretch which is known as Snake Road. It was presented in a 2-phase program about 7 years ago. I believe it started with some studies. All the players, city, state, DEP, community outreach were consulted. There were even renderings. I believe the plan is something that's on the phase to be for construction. So that's one of the things that I'm asking this panel, if this is one of the projects that would be funded by this bond act, and when, because we've been down this road. We have we participated, community participated, all the players, that were supposed to do input, gave their input, and we're still waiting. This is about 17 years later. So is this something that the bond act will support? And the other thing before you answer that was you mentioned about the school buses. Now, most of the school children in Rosedale walk to school. We do have some buses that come in to pick up the special education children and that take the students on school trips. Now, as far as the getting them the funding to get the newer buses, how would that information get to the contractors? And if that's something that you can share with the Civic Association so we can make sure that it does get into the hands of the contractors that would benefit from this. Because not everyone is going to know about this. There's a small group here. So how is the majority, the rest of the community, and the contractors that need this? So if you can share anything with the Civic Association, with the community leaders that's here, we can share with our members and our neighbors. So the first question is Snake Road.
Great. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yes.
So Snake Road, we are very familiar with in my office. Senator Sanders' office has been really instrumental in bringing together all sorts of government entities that have a potential stake in a potential project on Snake Road. So sometimes me, if my schedule allows, and definitely people from my office are on regular meetings with folks from DEP, folks from city parks, and most crucially, people from Department of Transportation. Because it's their road, and they're gonna have to be doing a project there if there's gonna be a project there. And so we're very, our agency at this juncture of that potential project is involved, but we are sort of at the place where other agencies are going through their processes to, I think, get a project sort of locked and loaded. And at that point, then they will be looking for funding. And I think that we've talked about the types of projects that the Bond Act can fund. So we can't come to you tonight and say, yes, this project will be funded. That's not the way that the Bond Act is written, and it's not our role to do that. We actually will not be involved in the selection of projects for the Bond Act because we're in this part of the process, which is developing the rules for the selection. So it wouldn't be fair for us to then weigh in on what actually gets selected. There will be, at some point, we hope sooner rather than later, a call for projects like road raising and road infrastructure. And at that point, I think the hope is that the Snake Road project will be at a point where it could then potentially have Bond Act funding, as well as other funding. You know, this is not the only place that that group of government officials is looking for funding for that particular road, because we understand the problems that are there. You know, we get the calls, we get the complaints, we do the enforcement against private actors who are doing not good things there. So it is a place that is heavily on our radar. It's someplace that we're invested in. And you know, I'm hopeful that there will be funding that will make it a reality. And the Bond Act is one of those places. And it's one of those larger places. So yes, it's the type of project. When it gets to that point, then I think there will be an application made for funding there. And I think it's important to, again, reiterate that Senator Sanders is a big, big proponent of that project.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, just to sort of clarify why we can't sit here today and say we will be funding Snake Road with the Bond Act. And it's just because there are firewalls and guardrails that we have to put up in order to be ethically responsible with your dollars, right? These are your taxpayer dollars, our taxpayer dollars that we're spending. And so there have to be programs identified and rules for how to run those programs, and then there has to be an open competitive process where folks compete for those projects, and we can't unilaterally say this project needs to get money and that project needs to get money, because there has to be a sort of ethical and separate process for how those dollars get spent. But it's absolutely on our radar. We recognize that it is a need, and as Patrick said, our team has been very involved in sort of understanding the issues along Snake Road. And just to turn it over to the school buses briefly, and then I think I'll turn it to Susanna if you want to add anything as well. You noted that most of the students here in this community walk to school as opposed to taking the buses. I just wanted to highlight that there are still significant benefits that Southeast Queens residents, students, and families alike can see from an investment in zero-emission school buses. Before I was at DEC, in a previous life, I was a pretty staunch electric school bus advocate. So I know that a disproportionate share of the school bus depots in New York City are right here in this community. A lot of buses that serve the entire city, diesel buses, are in and out of this community. So
Well, I mentioned that there are buses that pick up children in our community to take them to other districts. And the schools also use the school buses to take the students on field trips.
Right.
So there is a need. So I was just asking
Yes,
for that
absolutely.
need, so that we can share it with the school bus operators, contractors, the owners.
Totally.
Because they're not here, and they're not going to know how to apply for, even if they can.
So we can talk a little bit about the rollout of that program if you want to pick up.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things, part of why I made the shameless plug, please, please, please get on my mailing list, so to speak, is because we want to do more of that. We want to get the word out. there was the announcement, there will be another big announcement when that application process goes live for the NYSERDA program. And that's one of the things that's an important distinction is, and Patrick and Adriana have kind of clarified a little bit, like, so there's a program that is run by NYSERDA through which Bond Act dollars will be dispersed, right? So my job is to figure out how we get the money to them so that they can give it to folks through that program. But what I would say is, the rollout piece, we're using the website, but I'm all ears to how we can be more effective of getting the word out on whether it be each program moving forward or whether it be more feedback.
And that's the reason that we're here, and that I think Assemblymember Anderson really pinpointed, hey, I want you guys to come out to this community and talk with folks, because this sort of word of mouth, spreading the message, is an important piece of making sure that all of the communities throughout New York City understand what might be available under the Bond Act for them.
Thank you.
Yes. I have two questions. One following up on Snake Road. Because Snake Road, the proposal to raise that roadway came about with the New York Rising project. I don't know how many years ago, but it was supposed to be $6 million from the state for design of projects that would help with flooding. And Snake Road was a major part of that process. Bill Perkins and I were co-chairs of that committee. You mentioned when the project gets to the point of, so I guess gets to the point of being a viable project, because the New York Rising Funds was supposed to be enabling the study of that project to see, well, what's the feasibility. And so who's doing that? Was that study done, or who's doing that kind of a study now to make it possible to get it in the Bond Act tract?
Yeah. So I think that Senator Sanders' office can probably give you full updates on where that process is at, because as I said, they've been really amazing in coordinating the different state agencies and making sure that they're moving along, right? So my understanding is that DOT is in whatever stage in their process they need to be at to secure, excuse me, to secure, I think, federal funding for that type of a project. And
Federal
again,
study or federal?
I think it's about there's, as you're saying, there's been a lot of study already in design and ideas about this particular section of road. And I don't know technically the sufficiency or what's trying to be solved for now. Those are DOT engineer decisions.
Okay.
So I think it would be helpful, sounds like, for there to be a community update on Snake Road. And we can probably figure out how to do that best.
I just want to add that Sam Fine is the person from the Senator's office that is doing the Snake Road coordination. He is on the call and in the chat. So Sam, if you can put your email address if folks have follow-up questions on that, or if they'd like to join one of the calls that we have about Snake Road, ensure that he's able to provide those. I do know that Patrick has an 8 p.m. hard stop, so I want to get to some questions in the chat. So one more?
Yeah. As the presentation went on, it was clear that buckets of money have been allocated for different items. And my question was, how were those buckets determined? I mean, how was it determined that 1 million would go for here, but 8 million go elsewhere?
Good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the legislation itself is how those buckets are set up and how each of those subcategories is laid out. It actually specifically calls out in the act the not less than or up to amounts, and then divides them by, so much money can be used for this type of project. And the more broad categories are, so like the school bus example, it's our, first to roll out the door since I've been at DEC, so to speak. And it's, still kind of rolling to the real starting line. The other, it is very explicit, right? There's not really a gray area about we're going to fund school buses. Whereas the other categories, the flood risk reduction, and restoration category, the $650 million bucket has 2 paragraphs of potential eligible things. So, and it's Article 58, and it's environmental conservation law. You can Google Bond Act and pull up the text of it, and kind of parse through all the fun stuff that's in there. But that's how it's laid out.
So your elected officials, I think, is like the small.
Yes, probably the best.
The short answer to that. They determined it and then sent it to the public, and then we all voted for it. Not all of us, but like 70% or something.
Yeah.
Many of us.
A great
voted-
number of us. Yeah.
voted for it.
Yeah.
I'll make it quick. I just wanted to thank you all for coming out tonight. I don't want to miss the opportunity to say a special thanks to, and I know that many of the people who are participating tonight are online, and that's to be anticipated, given the weather, etc. But I'm hopeful that you've had a very good experience online, and I wanted to thank Taz from Chelio's Films for volunteering his services tonight to support this event. So that was so important to us, that the people who are coming in remotely have a good experience, and I hope that that is in fact the case. It will be also, it's been recorded, and you can access the recording afterwards. But one of the things I'll ask quickly is, in our community, and a lot of the community, neighborhoods in our community are not disadvantaged communities. And we experience a lot of environmental burdens that come out of being near JFK Airport. The aviation, the pollution from the airplanes, which nobody ever addresses. They address the electric trucks and reducing emissions from those, but they rarely say anything about airplane emissions and how we're going to address that. The trucks that the 18-wheelers that don't belong on our streets, but that are here, and the box trucks that all emit diesel fuels. Are there any particular, is there any particular emphasis on addressing the programs that will help to reduce those emissions and to maybe make those vehicles, the trucks in particular, electronic, to support that effort? We have a lot of ideas. We have big ideas in this community. So that's my question. Is there any emphasis on the trucking emissions?
Do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start, and then maybe Patrick will want to pick it up. So I would say yes, and I would say inside and outside of the Bond Act, there are opportunities across New York State for funding. Within the Bond Act, I think for things like electric school buses, comes to mind. That's not the 18-wheeler box trucks that you're talking about, but that is some electrification work for heavy-duty diesel that will happen. And there's sort of that other bucket under climate change mitigation, and there's, I think, 1.5 billion or 1.1 billion? 1.5 billion for climate change mitigation under the Bond Act, and there are the different buckets that Patrick can pull out on, but those all have to be geared towards reducing emissions, reducing pollution, and adapting to climate change and mitigating the impacts of climate change. There's a bucket in there, $200 million for in reducing air pollution in disadvantaged communities. And I know you mentioned that not all the areas of Southeast Queens are included in the disadvantaged communities criteria. But I think, so that's within the Bond Act. Outside of the Bond Act, we're in the process right now of implementing the state's Climate Act, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. One of the many components of that law is developing a mitigation strategy statewide for how to identify areas disproportionately burdened by air pollution, and then developing strategies to mitigate that pollution. We have undertaken a year-long study across the state to identify sources of air pollution. The law requires us to do that study in disadvantaged communities. There are several in Southeast Queens where that study has been ongoing. But the idea is that we take what we learned from that study and we can extrapolate, right, and triangulate where the sources are. And frankly, one of the biggest things we're learning so far, we're still going through quality assurance and quality control, so don't tell the Division of Air Resources that I'm saying this. But the early things that we're seeing is that what's causing the air pollution are are trucks. It's heavy duty diesel, it's traffic. That's what's causing air pollution across the state, in Southeast Queens, in New York City, and across the state. And so we're in the process now of developing what are the mitigation strategies going to look like, and those benefits will not just be in disadvantaged communities. Those benefits will be in all areas that show that there are high sources of air pollution, and that can be funded. Those strategies can be funded through things like the Bond Act, through a Cap and Invest program, which is an economy-wide program that we're building out right now, and other funding streams as well.
Thank you. So we'll move on to the chat. I'm going to group some of the questions together because they're related. But the first question is related to where will the job postings be found. So we have Lee who says, thanks for hosting this event. Where and when will those jobs be posted? And do you have a timeline?
Right, so the jobs that are created through the Bond Act are 3 kinds. First would be direct jobs, so the designers or engineers or architects or construction workers actually building the projects. The indirect being suppliers and then the induced jobs that are tallied in that overall figure are things like the local economy where those laborers are spending their dollar or they're using their salary to pay rent or pay for bills, etc. One of the things that is a theme across these projects with the New York State prevailing wage is that many of these projects will be publicly bid, if not all, and that's going to depend, of course, on the program. So, for example, the bus program is a voucher program, so you're not going to see that type of activity and so forth. And so many of those projects will go through the contract reporter and through the state register in terms of advertising when those projects are out for bid. There's also, I would also encourage reaching out through a couple of resources. Empire State Development runs the State's Minority Women Business Enterprise program, and so looking at opportunities. There's an opportunity, I'm trying to think of the name of their website. Do you know it off the top of your head? No. No, it's not Hub. I can't think of the name of it right now, but there's an opportunities portal really for connecting folks that they maintain in terms of construction projects that are coming out, and that's really the vehicle through which the jobs will be.
And for clarity, that's the MWB, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Alrighty, so I'll save the DEC questions for last. So we have Jay Proverbs that says, how can we get involved in the groundwork to implement some of these community-based projects, which is also followed up by Natalie's question, who's asking in general, should community members be working with electeds and government agencies to get projects planned so that they are shovel-ready? Since these are 10-year projects, it seems that municipalities/agencies will be instrumental in realizing them.
I think that's a good idea. That's a great comment, and I think it's part of the answer to should we start working in our communities. Yes, all those things. I think that there's also a lot of space in the Bond Act for community organizations also to work on projects and to apply for funding. And at this stage in the game, what's really, I think, critical is, again, getting in the information stream. So going to our website, signing up for our listserv, so that when project eligibility guidelines come out and they're published, you and your communities can interact with whatever agency that is that's developing that project and say, we have this type of a project and this eligibility guideline is not going to fit it, and we think that it should, and so we want you to make this change to that eligibility guideline. So that's the type of process that people, I think, should be gearing up for here. Identifying what kind of projects you think that your communities need, and some of you might already have those lists, and then making sure that you're getting the information about the decision-making processes that are going to be going on in all these agencies when they're pushing this funding out to the world.
Got it. And we'll have this information up on our communications and I believe as well as QA's same. So we have Natalie that says what is going to be the process for updating the disadvantaged communities criteria and when will that process begin? January, February? We also have a follow-up to that sentiment from Marcelia Cook, who is the president of the 149th South Wilson Park Civic Association, who says that Southeast Queens has been eliminated from the track census. My area includes following Rockaway Boulevard, southbound to northbound Conduit, 150th Street, and to the Vanway. In November 2019, we had a sewage backup and more than 200 homes were inundated with raw sewage. Our whole community needs to be included.
Sure, I'll take that one. Where we are now is we need to present, to the Climate Justice Working Group. There's a formal process there for an annual review of the disadvantaged communities criteria. This will be our first time, our first annual review, because we just voted on this criteria in March. And so we're still working that out internally on how we propose to run that process. And then we need to work in our open public forum through the Climate Justice Working Group meetings to deliberate on what that looks like. And so I can't speak to exactly what that will look like right now. It's not appropriate for me to speak on behalf of the whole Climate Justice Working Group, but that's something we're actively discussing right now. And you can follow along yourself via our Climate Justice Working Group meetings, all of which are live streamed. You can join via WebEx. So we also have set up in-person options where you can come and sit in person and observe the meetings. So that's where you can find that information, and we're expecting to be able to just discuss that at upcoming Climate Justice Working Group meetings over the next few months. To the second part of that, I would just say, it's not my job or my interest to tell anyone that they don't have disadvantages or they don't experience environmental burdens or environmental vulnerabilities. Everyone does, right? Especially in Southeast Queens. I know, especially we've heard about some of them today. The process for determining disadvantaged communities, was to develop this criteria that I laid out earlier in the presentation and score each census tract based on their the percentiles of those 4 buckets, right? The environmental burdens, climate change risks, socioeconomic outcomes, and public health. So any community that is not currently on that map, it doesn't mean that they were eliminated or excluded. What it means is that they didn't score high enough to meet the threshold to be in the highest scoring communities across the entire state. And that is what will be looked at again on an annual basis. And I think, we just want to emphasize that our intention here isn't to deny that you face disadvantages or climate burdens, and nor is it to deny anyone funding, right? I think this program is open for all of New York State, and we're committed across New York State to supporting and uplifting all climate vulnerable communities, whether they're disadvantaged communities or not.
Perfect.
Yeah, just quickly to follow up on that, in addition to looking at whether other communities should be on that map, are they also looking at some of the indicators to see if they left anything out? Because as you know, we are saying that aviation should have been included.
Sure. That's a good question, thank you. So just to clarify, we're still working through exactly what the annual review process will look like, but what we're thinking is that not only what we're looking at is the indicators that were chosen, additional indicators that have come in from community meetings like this or through other public comments or other areas, looking at additional ideas that are out there. We're also going to look at the methodology. How are we scoring? What are the thresholds? How are we doing our calculus? All of and that's on the table. And then the last thing that that's on the table is just, has the data that we used been updated? right? So there may be a data set that we used for, of the floodplain. But let's just say, the FEMA updated their flood maps. Maybe we use the same indicator, but we have newer data. So we're looking at all of those things. I think it's part of the annual review.
But I think that one of the things that's important to note is it's not you don't have to be considered a DAC community to obtain funds through the bond act, right? That's really important to remember that it's available to all communities.
And just to reiterate, the scoring process was 170 and then was reduced to 45 indicators, correct? So they do see a follow-up question for that. For the chat's purposes, as it relates to Snake Road, really want to reiterate that the reason the DC is not committing to whether or not funding is going in one way or another is because there is an ethical boundary there. Folks are handling money, they cannot then turn around and say, put it here. Just want that to be clear and simplified because I do see the chat. For follow-up questions and information regarding what is happening with Snake Road's improvement and where the agencies are with those improvements, Sam Fine from the Senator's office, who has his information in the chat, please, for everyone on the call and in the room, please get in touch with the Senator's office because they are leading the charge. Our team is involved in those meetings. However, Sam will have all of those answers to those questions, and if he does not have the answer, he will find it, but they just cannot commit to those answers at this moment because it's just not in their wheelhouse. Is everyone clear? Okay, perfect. We are at 8:05, so if there's no other questions, and if there's no other comments that don't pertain to specifically the Bond Act and those jobs and those resources, I'd like to say a very, very warm thank you to DEC for coming out. So and thank you all for spending the evening with us. And on behalf of the Assembly Members team as well as the Senators team, please, please, please reach out if you have questions. We don't want the community to feel disempowered by this process. We want you all to feel empowered, but we have to know what you're thinking, we have to know your suggestions, and the best way to do so is really calling and reaching out to those offices. So any other notes from the team?
Go to the website, use the Bond Act email address that's in the chat there. There's lots of information on the website, including some recordings of events like this that were done in other parts of the state. So there's a lot of information that's out there, and yes, reach out to us and we'll get you the information that we have.
One last quick question. Is there a timeline we need to think about in terms of giving feedback and talking about projects that we'd like to see happen?
Right, so we're digesting right now a whole pile of ideas and suggestions. We're open to having you keep them coming, right? We don't have a survey form up, but that email address is really where they should be directed so that I can get them and the team can get them and we can say, oh, okay, do we have an answer that maybe it's not a Bond Act answer, there's some other funding that's available immediately that we can direct folks to. Or it's, oh, geez, we haven't thought about those types of projects. So I would say go to the website and use that email, please. That's really the best way at this moment. And as we move forward, I think the reality is it's an iterative process, right? Any kind of grant offering is an iterative process where you say, hey, we have a lot of demand for this type of project and not so much for this one. Let's revisit how we functionally roll things out. And I wish I had a better answer for you about the rollout. I'd love to hear from you about other ways to get the word out better than just the website. Okay, excellent. Please do.
It's gonna be a process.
And we're still early.
And we're still early.
Yeah.
So you shouldn't feel like you're gonna miss out at this stage.
And we want to learn from, how do we do better each time with each program that rolls out and get the word out better.
And there's some materials over there, just last thing. There's little blue booklets that have all sorts of information about other funding as well, right? So if you have projects in mind, you might want to check that out because there's lots of different pots of money out there for people to take advantage of. Thank you again for having us.
Thank you so much.
stuff in the car. And I got to Jack.
Yeah.